Great. All right, welcome. We're live now. My name is Paco Nathan, and I'll be the host. We have, through the data mesh learning community, and also in cooperation with one of my favorite podcasts, Open Source Data, folks in both teams have kindly been working together to put together this panel discussion. And we're here today to talk about data discovery in the context of data mesh. And I'll just kind of frame it a bit. First off, by saying that there have definitely been some fantastic discussions about what is data mesh and how can you start to introduce this in your organization. This panel is looking more at the other issues that are surrounding data mesh that are very tightly coupled and very much co-evolving. So we're going to talk about data discovery here vis-a-vis data mesh, and also a lot of other kinds of practices that are tangential and very much involved in these kinds of practice. So first off, I'd like to introduce everybody. Let me go through here. And also, I should mention, we do have commenting that you should be able to see near the video, and we'll have those comments relayed. Scott, who is producing here, will be relaying from YouTube over into our video platform that we're using to record this. So there may be a little bit of delay, but please feel free to add any questions. We'll try to take them in process as we're having a discussion, and we'd really love to incorporate as much as possible of audience questions. Our overall goal for this is we're going to throw some hard problems at expert solution architects and really talk through, where do we have common ground? What are the issues we agree on or disagree? Not get into too much in the weeds about data mesh, but look at a lot of the important issues around it. And really, what are the practices that are needed going forward for data discovery? So collectively, the folks here have an amazing amount of hands-on experience, and it ranges across a number of areas: data engineering, data science, metadata management, MLOps, compliance, customer solutions in general. So I'm really super thrilled about our speakers and what kind of background they really have to share here. First off, I'd like to introduce Shinji Kim. Welcome, Shinji. Thank you very much for joining us here. I should give some background. Shinji is founder and CEO of Selectstar. That's an intelligent data discovery platform. It automatically analyzes and documents your data. I'm especially impressed, Shinji, your background. You've sought very challenging roles over the years and developed amazing background of complementary areas. I love the podcast interview that you did with Sam Ranji recently, and talking about how a lot of that kind of background has come to bear in data discovery, which I feel is a very interdisciplinary kind of practice in essence.
Thanks, Paco. Excited to be here. Having spent a lot of time as a software developer, data scientist, data analyst, product manager, and data engineer, I think data discovery is something that affects all of us, whether you're on the producer or consumer side. So excited to talk about that with also other amazing panelists here that have spent a long time in data.
Fantastic. And next up, Mark Rover. Mark is founder of Stemma and co-creator of an open source project called Amundsen. Mark and I have been collaborating on different things since the days when big data was young, back in the early 2010s. And definitely throughout your work at Cloudera and Lyft and other projects that we've worked together on. Certainly, you and your team had some of the most popular tutorials back in the O'Reilly conferences when we talked about big data solutions. And so, welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Paco. It's great to be here. Appreciate you having me. And like you mentioned, we started big data when we were little kids. So we've been doing this for a while. And I've had the good fortune of working with Paco in the past, and especially when I was at Cloudera, where I was an engineer, and I ended up co-authoring a book called Hadoop Application Architectures that sold over 10,000 copies that put us in touch. And since then, I've gone from engineer to a product manager and created Amundsen at Lyft, and excited to be a part of the discussion today with these amazing panelists.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Sophie, welcome. Sophie Watson is principal data scientist at Red Hat. And Sophie, I've got to say that we've done a lot of speaking together in similar conferences and tracks. And one of the things that strikes me is consistently when a lot of experts are up at the stage trying to explain the nuances of complex practices that are emerging, I found that you always come away with like the best illustration that the audience can really understand the topic finally. So I'm super impressed with your background in data science and data engineering, and really being able to convey and connect with the audience about these kinds of complex topics.
Thanks, Paco. That's really kind. I learned everything I know about conference talks and illustrations and communication from William Benton, so I can't not give Will a shout out on this panel. So I mean, access to data is a hurdle that every data scientist has hit at some point in their day, probably already. It's only 11 a.m. here, but I think we've all been bitten by this. So obviously I want to, be part of this community and learn about how we can make these problems go away. So thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Shirshanka, welcome. I'd like to introduce Shirshanka Das. He was the founder of LinkedIn Data Hub project, a very popular project in the metadata management space. Also Apache Goblin, and now founder of Acryl Data. Shashank is also co-author of a very seminal paper. It's called Ground, a Data Context Service. This is a paper, I believe it's 2017, but it really framed a lot of this general area of problems that we're working with. And also, Shashanka, we've collaborated on the Metadata Day events, and you've done a couple of those. I'm super impressed with how you've helped build community and dialogue around these topics.
Thanks, Paco. It's been great collaborating with you in the past. I'm so excited to be here and talk about this topic. It feels like data discovery is like a new term that we're talking about these days. And as I was reflecting on kind of the last 10 years working on data at LinkedIn, building online storage systems, streaming infrastructure, and then big data systems, this problem has been there at the center all the time. Like, how do we make data easy to access? How do we make consumers understand what data they're really using? And I think most importantly, and this is why I'm so excited about data mesh, how do we make producers, give them the mechanisms they need to produce high quality data products? So I'm really excited to be here. And when we collaborated with Joe on the Ground project, it kind of laid some theoretical underpinnings. It has inspired a lot of projects. In fact, when we built the third generation of metadata at LinkedIn, a lot of those things were influential in how we designed Data Hub, and I'm really humbled by how it has enabled data discovery for so many organizations around the world. Super excited to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's jump into some discussion. Thank you all. I'm gonna kind of go round robin, but please jump in at any point and add. And we also look forward, like I say, that we'll be taking Q&A relayed from YouTube streaming. Scott's going to do relaying that into our moderated chat that we have for the speakers. So first off, let's get this started. Why is data discovery important? And actually, I'll throw this question to Shinji. Can you frame, like, why is it that data discovery is its own area that we should be looking at?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is that overall, in order for you to utilize your data or analyze your data, you're collecting data in the first place because you're going to use it somewhere, right? And we see this as more of a pattern where you first need to have data access, you need to be able to touch the data. But then once you are once you have the ability to access the data, you do need to understand what exists and where it is in order for you to start querying, analyzing, or actually making any decisions based on that data. And that part is what I would call data discovery, being able to find and understanding the data, which is, I would say, is in the critical path of any data analysis, any modeling, or any manipulation of data. So that's why I would say it's a very fundamental thing that's important to just overall any data professionals and industry.
And this is also, I mean, to characterize this is a very dynamic kind of area. It isn't like you just set a catalog of schema and it's written once and then used many times. This is something that's changing all the time, right?
Yeah, I would say what's changing more now is with the rise of modern data stack, more companies being able to collect data not just from their apps and websites, but from many different SaaS tools that they use, and being able to connect those data with product data in one place is definitely, I mean, the area of data discovery, I think, is very much being looked at again by a lot of other companies because now it's not also just the centralized data team that's using the data. There are product managers, ops analysts, sales ops people, and engineers that are continuously looking at and finding different parts of the data that the company owns.
Oh, fantastic.
And if I may add on, there's another interesting thing here, which is why now is the right time to solve this problem. And I think Shinji explained really well, what is the problem and what it means and why it's important. But I find that over the last 5-10 years, we've done a lot of innovation in getting data into a centralized place, right? So we've got Stitch, Fivetran, a whole bunch of other systems, Kafka, that let us bring data into the organization. Then we've invested energy in infrastructure like Snowflake, BigQuery are a huge thing now, which allow you to centrally store this data. And then we've had tools like Tableau, Looker, Mode that allow you to do analytics. There's people who we have democratized sort of access to data to these people. And so we are hiring data-driven product managers, data-driven sales enablement people, right? So the organization, A, has people hungry for data, B, has tons of data, right? So the problem isn't that we aren't bringing data in or that the tools to consume data aren't there. The problem is there's so much data that no one has any idea what data exists, all these things that Shinji was mentioning, what data exists, why it exists, how it's being used, where is it, can I trust it, all these things are the things that are preventing data from being used in the organization, and that's why this problem is so important to solve now.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring that up, Mark, actually, because I think it's so true for a lot of organizations today, primarily because you are moving your centralized data warehouse into the cloud. And the way that we are now ingesting and processing data is not through the ETL phenomenon, it's now ELT. And with the transformation that all happens on top of the data lake or data warehouse, you actually end up with more data sets. That's confusing to not just the data team, for everyone else. But the phenomenon around decentralized ownership and maintenance of data sets under that data lake or data warehouse, as well as the a lot more distribution of data access by not just the data team, but also everyone else inside the company, makes data discovery a problem or a issue for a lot wider audience. And I think that's why it's the why now is this a really important thing. Makes sense for.
I think if I can add one more thing that's happening is that even our conceptualization of what is data has changed. Initially, it was just tables in the warehouse, but nowadays it's much more than that. It's, yes, the BI dashboards, the reports, it's also the ML models and the features, and that's on the consumption side, but then on the production side, we're starting to talk about the Kafka streams upstream of the warehouse. We're starting to talk about the Postgres and the operational databases upstream of that. And then we're also starting to talk about the APIs that are kind of the front office for the company, and really trying to get an end-to-end understanding of what is the flow of data from the time it enters the organization's kind of data boundaries to the time it leaves it. And everything that touches it needs to be understood and mapped. And what I see repeatedly in the community, both in like our open source community as well as in customers and the industry at large, is that there are like too many tools. And it's not just the data that is in different places, but it's just too many tools.
Yeah.
And this kind of hyper specialization that we're on has kind of created a new problem of sorts, that people just don't know where everything is at. And if I want to replace my BI tool with another thing, I just don't know what is going to get impacted and where everything is at. So I think that, and data mesh maybe is going to accelerate that a bit more as domains get even more autonomy to decide their whole stack. It's going to make it even harder and more important to understand where everything came from and where it's going.
Right. And I think, we've got more and more data, and like you said, Shashanka, like it's being used all the way through the chain and people are thinking about it at every point. But that means more and more personas are interacting with it as well. So we have people interacting with data and making data-driven decisions, which is fantastic, and using all this information that's out there, but that don't necessarily have kind of a strict background in understanding data or doing this in a sensible and ethical way.
Yeah.
So anything that can make that data easier to find, easier to understand, and easier to use responsibly is a winner.
Fantastic. I want to just catch briefly. There were a few terms that came out, and for some of the folks who maybe haven't heard it before, one phrase was about ETL versus ELT, and another phrase was about upstream, as in like upstream Kafka. Could somebody take and break this down a bit?
Well, I mean, I guess we can talk quickly about ETL versus ELT. The old school philosophy was around, transforming a lot of data in flight before loading it into your warehouse. And, companies like Informatica pioneered the ETL movement. I still think they did a fantastic job at creating kind of that single holistic view of how you're modifying your data. But what has emerged over the last couple of years, I think, even when we were doing kind of our Kafka ETL back at LinkedIn, I noticed that we were moving into this model of storage is cheap, data lakes are plentiful. Let's just copy all the data into the data lake or the warehouse and then transform it later, because the warehouses have evolved to, handle that kind of abuse, for lack of a better word. And so don't throw away data in flight. You might need it. Just copy it all in from your source systems and then decide to transform. So that's the ETL ELT movement that has definitely happened. It also leads to what I noticed, simpler and more operable pipelines. I think I had a background as a platform engineer, so it's much easier to copy bytes over and to say, did I get it all right? Versus I'm copying bytes and I'm also transforming and doing a few joins as I go, and oops, I lost a bunch of data, but maybe that was intentional, maybe that was not. So that's definitely been one reason why ELT has caught on. It leads to more operable and simpler pipelines, because cross-system things are anyway hard. Why do you want to introduce transformations in the middle of it?
Right. Well, there's another term that definitely hear a lot about in terms of like reverse ETL with respect to machine learning, because I mean a lot of what we do uses of the data on data science teams. We might be doing annotations, or we might be doing some sort of embedding work with deep learning, but then we end up with additional products, and it has to blend back in with our original data.
Yeah, Mark had a chuckle, so I'll let you.
Yeah. I'll with the guy with the chuckle, I'll take the first pass at this, but would love to hear other people's thoughts on this too. It's a relatively new category. There are two products in this space that are often getting talked about, Census and High Touch. And the idea is that you can take the transformed data that you have in your warehouse and stick this back into the systems that business users end up using, right? So you have your customer success person who's always in Salesforce, and they're using this thing to actually decide which customers do I support today based on some model that was run in my warehouse that produced my data in Snowflake. And so I think like there's a big open question as to like how are these reverse ETL tools different than the ETL tools that exist, and if they should be the same or different. And I think there are like different varying schools of thought in here. But what is clear is that there's a deep need for taking the learnings that we have stored in this centralized warehouse in one place where people have done some learning and analysis, and put them back in the hands and the flow of the users who are going to make that decision. And that is such a core tenet of anything that we should be doing in the data space. Is like, how can you, especially with the fragmentation of various tools, how can you take some insight that's buried somewhere and put that in the flow of the user who's going to use that insight? And the flow of the user may actually mean that it has to go to a different tool than yours, that they don't have to come to your product in order to see that, and that you push it out in their way so they find it when they need it the most.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Alrighty, let's go to some other questions here. Thank you very much for breaking that down. We've had some questions coming in, and I think we'll bring these up as well a little bit more toward some strategy. So let's get through some of the more intro material here first. It's important. I mean, here we are in the data mesh learning community. Can we set the stage for what's the role of data discovery in data mesh? And Shirshanka, you had started to discuss this some. Can you discuss go into a little bit more detail about that?
Sure. I think the data mesh is all about splitting up your centralized data ecosystem into data domains, and then applying a really high quality data product thinking to how data is shared across those domains. And I really think about data discovery as the capability for enabling that metadata plane or the control plane on the data mesh, right? When we talk about service discovery, and a lot of the data mesh terminology has been inspired by kind of the service mesh terminology. And so when you think about service discovery, well, what is service discovery? It's really the pods or the services registering to, is Zookeeper still a thing these days? Registering to Zookeeper or Etsy nowadays, I guess, and saying, here's where I'm at. And so how do we apply the same thing to data? Well, data products should be registering themselves. And I think one of the things like data discovery has initially attempted to is really do as much of like scraping and understanding of log files and understanding of stuff on the ground to be able to stitch together somewhat of a picture of what do you have. But what I'm really excited about is with data mesh, you can kind of invert that model and say we don't have to be defeatist anymore, and we can actually have data products push metadata out from the data domains into the central metadata fabric. And that leads to much higher quality data discovery experiences, because you're actually producing data products that have a much higher bar for existing. It's not just enough to have a name. You also need to have an owner, and you need to have a published schema, and maybe you have your compliance tags attached with you as you produce yourself. So I'm really excited about what data mesh can do to simplify a lot of the hill climbing that data discovery practitioners have been doing over the years in trying to stitch together facts on the ground.
Well, one of the questions that comes up. Okay.
Yes. So for data mesh, I think it's really interesting because like a lot of companies are basically realizing that they already had all these different domain experts creating their own models and different data sets inside the data warehouse, or even just in different parts of the data system. It could be very different databases, but it still exists inside the same company infrastructure, right? But I think the full notion of data mesh, the way I think about it is it's really the extension of how you're now recognizing that, yes, like the way that we model, consume, produce data is in a way, all decoupled. So almost like how we are moving also from like ETL to ELT, which I feel like is very much of a like decoupling of you just load the data first and then worry about the transformation after. Also with data mesh, different domain owners should own and manage their own models. And I think with decoupling, the parts that are also really important is this aspect of, so if I want to access data or something else, or the service that I didn't create but want to utilize it, how am I going to find out or understand how to use it without having to build it again myself, right? So I think that part around data mesh is like where data discovery affects a lot. So some of the customers that we are working with right now, they have this data mesh model already. Initially, they will start utilizing Selectstar as like a data discovery platform, so that initially they're just like finding out about the data, which I felt like was like a very much of a where discovery kind of can start from with data mesh. But then like as they are starting to put tagging, ownership, and then starting to invite their different team members of the company, they can basically provide a way to also have some, like, I don't want to call it just like full governance or control, but way for maintaining a source of truth while the ownership is still decoupled. And I feel like that's like the beauty of data mesh, and it can, something that can work really well with a good data discovery. So that's kind of like how I see the intersection of data discovery and why it's so important for data mesh.
Really interesting. So, I mean, when we hear the word governance, and on the one hand, there's this idea of like the Magna Carta and some sort of federal judiciary, and like, it's a really elaborate system. But what you just described was more a matter of practice, like within an organization. A lot of people in the organization who are touching the data, what are their governance practices? And what you're describing there are ways of making it so they can actually be engaged in it. They can actually be contributing.
Yeah, and also visibility. Just being aware of what's been actually created or what other team have already done gives you a lot of context, and you can reuse it instead of building everything on your own.
Over and over. Mark, you had some experience on this. I'll quote from, or paraphrase rather, from some of your articles about experiences at Lyft. But this was one of the learnings when you were developing Amundsen, if I recall.
Absolutely. Which paraphrase you're going after? I make a lot of.
No, sorry. I should have given that more context. So the idea of like, I think a lot of data teams, in my experience leading data teams, we spend a lot of time relearning the metadata over and over and looking it up. And as Shinji was describing, I know I have in the past, like you leave one business unit for 6 months to work on a different business unit's problem, then you come back to it, the metadata is all changed, and you have to like rediscover it all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing at Lyft was when I had gotten there from after working at Cloudera for 5 years, and most of Cloudera customers were very different nature than Lyft. And Lyft was all on the cloud. They had this data warehouse, and they were growing double every year, right? So we went from like 1,000 to 2,000 to 4,000 to 8,000. And the thing was, we were hiring all these skilled people who had the knowledge of making data-driven decisions, but they didn't have the context within the company. And I remember this data scientist, one of my first user interviews at Lyft was a data scientist working on ETAs, which is the time a car driver takes to get to you, right? And so we've taken Lyft rides, you open your app, I tell you like, hey, Sophie, your driver is 2 minutes away, right? And you go through the funnel, and this ETA keeps on increasing. Well, it's 3 minutes, 4 minutes, your driver shows up at your door like 7 minutes later. Does that happen to you, Sophie?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we've all been there, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So like the
Does
problem...
that not happen to you, Mark?
Yeah. we had a special version of the app where that did not happen.
I think, and
Please.
Mark can drive himself as well. I presume that's
right.
why you were calling me out.
Yeah. So the problem with ETAs is that we measure ETAs 5 times in a session. So even a simple question like, what was the ETA, doesn't make sense, because you have to ask yourself, well, when did you measure the ETA, right? And the other thing is, we had all these models logging data into the warehouse. Sometimes we would have shadow models. So you have the one model that's showing data to the user, Another one running on the side that's never showing any data and won't change any behavior, but it's being logged, and you can't really tell which one was the right one in retrospect, right? But you also have like 20 models of the past that were in production at some point that never made it to production. So you look at your warehouse, and you've got over 200 columns, so many dashboards that have something to do with ETA. And simply asking the question, where is the source of truth data for actual ETAs in San Francisco over the last week was so hard, right? And the canonical way to solve this problem historically has been, we'll get a data steward. So it's either a full-time person or a volunteer responsibility you assign to somebody and be like, thou, Shirshanka, shall keep this particular tag as a source of truth and move it as my organization evolves, right? The problem is in fast-moving organizations, data is changing so rapidly that you can't keep this up to date. And there's no people are busy. There's no formal data steward responsibility for them to keep this up, right? And that's the other reason why data discovery has become so important, because curated means of cataloging your data no longer work. And what you need is automation signals like, this thing is like last updated this morning, right? This thing hasn't been updated for the last 10 months. This thing is powering X number of models or X number of dashboards, right? Your coworkers all use this thing. Like, all these signals become super important in you informing what's trustworthy instead of relying on this curated information that someone is maintaining for you.
Well, this discussion reminds me of, sorry, go ahead, Paco.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Great.
This discussion reminds me of another inconsistency that I had to deal with at LinkedIn when we were doing governance, and governance often leads to compliance. Are we allowed to use that word here?
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that happened was, we had Data Hub, and it was being used for kind of compliance tagging and a few other things. And one of the things we often forget when we talk about data discovery, and notice, in the last 30 minutes, we haven't talked about data discovery for code. Most of the data discovery we talk about is always for humans. There's a person looking for a data asset. There's a person trying to understand. But really, when you start implementing compliance, you can no longer have people going around and scrubbing data rows for GDPR compliance or things like that. That's probably an agent that's actually taking action on the metadata that you have. And so data discovery can not just be a human thing, it actually has to be consistent. Like, when I search for page view event on Data Hub at LinkedIn and I get this as the top rank result, and when Goblin wakes up at night and starts scrubbing page view event, the query it makes to Data Hub has to return exactly that same ID. And so this problem has to get solved not only at the human level, but also at the code level. You need to have real programmatic abstractions where the data discovery abstractions for humans have to also apply to data discovery abstractions for code. And we see this with feature registries and model registries and all of these things. These all need a backend that they can reliably ask at runtime, I've got a model ID, where is it at? Give me the model. What are the compliance tags? What is the inference capabilities? What are the tags on this thing, so that I can, at runtime, apply the right policies before rendering this back. And I think that's kind of the next challenge for data discovery, is to also apply to programmatic use cases.
Well, that ties into a question that's come up, and actually there's been a little bit of iteration on the question. I mean, we are talking about systems of people and machines working together. So we definitely have a lot of automation. We have a lot of code. We have models that are derived from data, built through code. But there's also a lot of people. And if you were to draw a diagram about this, there's a lot of complex interactions throughout. One of the questions that's come up is this concept of info overload, or I would probably break that down more into like cognitive load. So, yeah, I mean, we can have a company, gosh, the last several startups that I've looked at in Silicon Valley, one of the first things you do is sign up for about 20 different SaaS services just to get your company going. I know I had to, and then you've got some metadata exhaust from each one of those, and you're trying to keep track of it, which is, Shinji, what you were talking about earlier about all these different components. So there's cognitive overload in terms of push and pull, which is what was being debated or discussed. There, it's possible that people could take the actions to go out and track down the metadata for every different system that they have to work with, and Mark, as you were saying, go back through and find out what is the ground truth. So I don't know which is the push and which is the pull, but does the onus fall on the person who's using the data to go out and do that due diligence, or does the onus fall on, I think, Mark, what you were describing earlier was about the people who are creating the data, the producers. What responsibilities do they have for making this discoverable, and what are some practical ways on the ground in working with customers? Where does that balance lie? Where does that trade-off lie? Am I making sense on this?
Yeah, I think so.
Sophie,
Go on, Mark.
Sophie, would you like to go first? I've been talking quite a bit.
Okay.
So you go first.
I mean, I see the onus being on everyone. I see it kind of like open source communities, right? For new open source projects. People contribute and put time and love and effort in because they're getting something out of it eventually. I think if we are saying, okay, it's your specific role to go through and tag all this and catch all this information, then it's just not going to happen. I mean, that doesn't sound like that much fun to me,
Right.
if that's all you're doing all day, every day. But when you see the benefits of actually using this as part of a wider community and see what it brings, then I think it gains the momentum. And so if it's always hard to get started with something, right? But once you've kind of used this for a while and then you find some data that doesn't have the information that you want with it, then I think you're more incentivized to go and add it there so that someone else doesn't have to relive the pain that you just lived. Mark?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. In fact, I just recently wrote a blog post on the two most common reasons why efforts around, I think data catalogs and data discovery are like interrelated terms. And I wrote a blog post why two common reasons why data catalogs fail. And what Sophie described is like actually the first reason, which is you don't have enough documentation in there in order to actually people to derive value, right? And one thing that I believe strongly from having worked with many companies in the Amundsen open source community at Lyft and now with customers at Stemma is that in the best time to get this documentation is when this is in the head of the person who has this documentation, right? So take an example, say you're creating a new event that's going to stream down to the data warehouse. And this sometimes could be an event that's being created in a marketing web tool like Heap or Segment or something like that, right? Getting that information from them when they're creating that and enforcing checks and balancing right there, that if they didn't put that information that their code won't go through, is like a great way to actually ensure that the description trickles down, right? And then once it does trickle down and you are building derived sources, you can actually, a good chunk of the documentation can further trickle down based on the processing you're doing, right? So I'm saying that you can reduce the amount of documentation you need by understanding what is being built from what, but B, like get the documentation in the flow of the user, and in my opinion, that would be the person producing the data in the first place. They have some context in their head and like grab that from them right in that moment.
Interesting.
I
So
also want to add something to this.
Shinji.
I do also believe that having a good amount of annotation, documentation is very important, especially for the producer side of the things. At the same time, there's so much data that also gets created or rephrased on top of the raw data. And it just creates a lot more tables. So what do? Like, do you just like copy and paste like, well, it has already existed? Like that itself is a lot of manual work. And few things that we are starting to see that we feel like is a part that can be really helpful is kind of propagating some documentation that already exists from the upstream side to the downstream. But overall, I think regarding this like overload of both producer side and consumer side. I think because I actually think that both sides actually have the responsibility of annotating or creating the better this data discovery platform. But I feel like for a lot of modern data discovery platforms, like the companies we are all working on, I also, just because I also wrote a blog post about this, how like there's so much manual work that's not being automated. I think there needs to be two main things that needs to happen. One is automation, and then the second part is like really easy user experience. So with the automation part, I'm talking about being able to pull out existing operational metadata to augment the discovery perspective, so that the users can still find what they're looking for, even if it may not have like a full documentation. For instance, one of the things that we see a lot in Selectstar is how people actually like search a keyword and then being able to find like the specific field of what they are looking for, even though the same exact field exists in the data warehouse, same like thousands of other fields, like user ID exists in like hundreds of other tables. But how do they know which exact user ID column that you're going to use? That will be driven by popularity, and we calculate our popularity score based on like the number of select queries that mentions that ID and how often those run, how many unique users are running. So those are types of the automated insights that people can use in order to like foster this type of better documentation. When you know how the data is currently being used, it is like a great ways to understand and like start creating more documentation on top. I think the other part that like both I think Mark and Sophie like alluded to is putting in some like a process in place. So your pull request process, you do have to add the descriptions per new column that you're creating. I think those are all really good best practices to put in. At the same time, for the existing data, for all the 100,000 columns you have, it may be a little bit harder to just enforce everyone to just do the documentation from the get-go. So I think having more of these like automated insights, I think is one part that is very helpful, and it's something that a lot of companies are starting to support, including like creating the lineage or so that you can propagate different information, as well as like the popularity is another part. And then in terms of the user experience perspective, I think on the consumer side, how and where this data is being used. Is this data primarily used for like sales report or product analytics, things like that? I think it can also be very helpful to help others to recognize that these are the right set of data sets to use. And that itself can be also very much of an overload. So I think the other part where automation can help is once the data analyst team or more business intelligence teams can define the high level of like a structure of how they would view categorizing the data, then other people can contribute on like whether they like just by either tagging the data. But the part that where automation can also help is by telling you who is using these types of data the most of the time, and then by looking up like which team they belong to or which teams is using which types of data the most. I think is also another piece that can really help the documentation or foster the initial documentation effort that usually needs to also happen with data discovery. Sorry, I think
Fantastic.
I put up a lot of stuff out there, but yeah.
Oh, it's great. Well, I want to try to paraphrase that a bit. Then also, so looking at data discovery and a lot of the issues and nuances here, Sophie, you were bringing up an analog with say open source culture and how people will find something that could be a lot better. Here's a PR. Let's fix this. If we find like here's something that like we know is missing, let's go ahead and fix this. And there's one of the things I love about working in open source is almost kind of a gamification of like working through PRs and knocking down problems. And then Mark, you're describing what I think might be an analogy of say pre-commit hooks. Like you've got a project and you've got end developers working on a thing, and now let's go ahead and refine how we're using our pre-commit hooks so that we don't keep making the same mistakes over and over again. We can try to catch it closer to the source of the root cause. And Shinji, you were talking a lot more about almost like a dependency graph like you would see in an open source packaging system, but like a dependency graph for propagating metadata descriptions about data and data discovery. And then on top of that, also, I think touching, you really articulated well about a lot of the kind of UX issues that come into discovery. Like things have to be searchable. They have to be something that people can go in and find conveniently.
Right, and searchable by everybody. We're not just talking about the people who understand what pre-commit hooks are.
Right, exactly,
We're
yeah.
talking about, that everybody who is touching this data needs to be able to confidently know why it is tagged in, but have confidence in the tags that are there, and have the ability to contribute more to them without having to, get a Git account, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
One thing that I've noticed resonate a lot, and this is kind of tying into what Mark was talking about, is kind of treating data as code and treating metadata also as code. And so essentially, we see it a lot in kind of the data mesh community, especially kind of the early adopters like Saxo Bank. And, LinkedIn was accidentally doing data mesh. We just didn't know that it was called data mesh back then. But we had this, having this ability to say, when you're creating a data product, a thing that has something more than just a schema associated with it, what are the rules for what makes it valid? And being able to apply those rules as part of the build system, right? It needs to have documentation on it. The compliance tags have to actually align with the glossary of compliance terms. That's actually a build check. In the IDE, you actually get autocomplete. So we need to have kind of these systems integrated up into the individual tools so that the likelihood, just like with data, we want the likelihood of producing bad metadata to be as low as possible out of the gate. And so your system, the data discovery tool or platform really has to support this kind of versioning of metadata and the ability to have lots and lots of versions of metadata attached to lots and lots of versions of code so that you get kind of this ability to time travel through your metadata and time travel through your code. And I think that really can unlock a lot of capabilities that we're kind of missing in our current tool stack.
Well, there's a related question that came in, and we've had wonderful questions coming in. There's a big stream, probably more than we'll get to, but I'm going to try to weave them in. We've been weaving them through the conversation already. Noel O'Connor asked, does there need to be a promotion process? And I think, Shirshanka, this goes back to some of what you were just saying. Does there need to be a promotion process to ensure that data is accurate enough and trustful enough? Something akin to APIs in Kubernetes, where you have alpha, beta, GA.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, just like you canary services before you actually turn them on, you need to be able to canary data sets. And you need to be able to say, this data set is available, but its proof of life and its proof of goodness is not yet there because maybe the next person who tried to use it fails miserably, and that kind of puts it in a, and I see a lot of attempts at trying to give extreme versioning applied to the data ecosystem, and I think it's a very exciting trend. And I think that can enable this kind of ability to achieve what we do with services with data.
Are those kind of features available in, say, an open source? Like that kind of promotion process?
Sort of. I think we see capabilities where folks are checking in schemas with compliance rules, and then there are essentially GitHub actions that are able to check with the metadata service whether this particular commit is valid based on the rules that they've defined in the metadata service. And if it's not, then that data set cannot be promoted. But I think the combination of metadata versioning and data versioning is kind of an evolving space. I see like a few projects like Nessie and LakeFS coming up around kind of versioning of data assets.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see whether that can be combined with versioning of metadata at kind of the logical level as we talk about as well. I think it's going to be pretty interesting.
I think that notion applies really well on the data producer side. And on the data consumer side, I think the other notion that's also really helpful is utilizing tags. So for us at Selectstar, we have a notion of status, tags, and a lot of customers use it actually at least to define which are the certified data sets, so that new analysts or anyone that's like initially looking at the data like knows which these are like proven and tried and true. These are the analytics data tables that everyone is using. But also we've seen customers marking their tables as gold, silver, bronze, raw versus like beta. So yeah, alpha, beta, GA I think is definitely another ways to utilize the type of tags and attach certain status to the data set on the consumer side of the things. And I think it needs to always happen on both sides, right? You can't like do only one side and you can't avoid the ocean. So yeah.
Yeah, that's an
I think what
important.
is interesting for me, sorry, go ahead, Paco.
Well, just always ensuring that the audit is both producer and consumer side. That seems to be like a really key point here. I think some systems tend to bias one or the other.
Yeah, one of the things I have noticed with tagging is tagging itself is an interesting automation problem. And then, Paco, I know you're kind of an expert on knowledge graphs, but even the fact that what makes a data set a goal data set might be something that someone stamps on a data set today, and they had some policy in their head about what makes it a gold data set, but they didn't encode the policy. Instead, they went and stamped the data set as gold. But next week, that policy got violated, but the data set is still stamped as gold.
Yeah.
And the policy maybe was, oh, this data set should land before 7 a.m. every day for the last week. Maybe that was really the policy. Maybe it's really a reliability policy that makes something a gold data set or not. But if we are able to actually encode those policies and say, if you meet those characteristics, you get the gold tag, then that leads to a much more vibrant manageability of these tags themselves, where you don't have humans applying these tags, but the tags really are a predicate on the metadata. And so you get the tag based on your performance, not because someone stamped it on you. So that might be an interesting way to even manage these tags governance or tag application.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
they're-
maintaining the status certainly can be done really well with having some workflow or automation built on top, for sure. Go ahead, Sophie. Sorry.
Excellent. Sophie.
Sorry. I think my main concern with this notion of promoting data sets is exactly this, of things getting, tagged at time X and this just perpetuating. And we know how badly problems perpetuate through machine learning systems because of X, Y, and Z. And it's the same with this data, right? The other thing is, I think in a lot of these cases, we're focusing on this notion of multiple groups of people using the same data sets in exactly the same way. So for exactly the same thing or to gain exactly the same insights. And I want to push back from that a bit and say, if people are doing that, then you've got a bigger problem in your company. People are duplicating work somewhere. What we really want is, the data to be used in new and interesting ways because it's easier to find and discover. And so I am interested to see how we progress over the next few months and years with tagging and boosting up data sets and stamping them as good.
Well said, Sophie. What you're describing there really overlaps a lot of some of the current threads in AI. And Shirshanka, you used the word predicate. I think that what we're talking about here is this kind of metadata really does need to be inferred, and inference is a hard problem. It's something where we can combine the domain experts and policy, but we can also combine machine learning. And when you do have graph representations, then you can start to test the tags and the policies for things like uncertainty. So, looking at like what Lise Couture and her team do at Santa Cruz with probabilistic graphs, that would be a really ideal thing to try to apply to figure out, hey, wait, are the policies being invalidated by the tags that we've added, or how much uncertainty does adding this next tag create? Okay, I'll jump off that horse. I've been reminded we only have a few minutes left. Yeah, okay, so there have been some questions definitely want to try to hit here. Mohammed, you had some excellent questions. Mohammed Chafra asked, at what limit does data discovery reach its limit when handling PII, personal identifiable information? And how can we try to well, yeah, how can we try to consume this in a secure way? How can we make it consumable in a secure way? So, we've been talking about some policies for data discovery. What are some of the limits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think historically, like there's one approach here, which is if the data is not accessible to you, say because it's sensitive, that you should not be able to discover it. And I actually disagree with that approach. And I've seen that not work for a good chunk of companies. And the reason I disagree with that is because it becomes a chicken and egg problem. If you don't know this thing exists, you don't know if you can use it for the work you're about to do, and therefore you can't get access to it. So it prevents your decision-making ability using that data if you had a path to getting access to it, right? And so the approach that I have seen work in modern organizations is that it's accessible that such data exists, it's known that it's sensitive, and then you don't see some richer metadata around it because of its sensitivity. So you may not see what queries are being run on it. You don't see any profiling of the data. You can't preview the data. But the existence of the data is there for you, right? And it prevents the chicken and the egg problem. You can discover all the data that's present at the company. You know there's some sensitive information here. And then you can say like, okay, well, this is what I need, and I'll find a path to actually getting access to it. And I've seen that to be a much more successful way. So to summarize, the path I'm seeing most companies adopt in my world is accessibility and understanding of data is democratized even for sensitive data to a certain extent. And then richer metadata is blocked unless you have access to it. And when you get access to it, you can see that richer metadata.
I mean, that's something that comes up in healthcare a lot, is like de-identification is probably one of the top use cases for NLP now in AI in healthcare. And so there can be a path even to sensitive data if you can go through enough of the de-identification. Sorry.
Yeah, I believe strongly that metadata infrastructure should just mirror data infrastructure. So just like in data, we have RBAC and ABAC and the ability to anonymize data at point of access. We should have the same capabilities on metadata itself. So if you have access to the data, that implies you have certain level of access to the metadata. And if you don't have access to the data, that implies you have a different level of access on the metadata. We actually have companies that that we are working with where even the table names are sensitive.
Yeah.
And they don't, like, a single domain does not even want another domain to know that this table name exists. So as we're building kind of the RBAC capabilities and the access control capabilities in Data Hub, we're having to design for those kind of scenarios as well, where depending on the access privileges you have, you may not be able to even see the name of the table, but you might be able to see the tags on the table. So it's quite interesting. And I think as long as you mirror kind of capabilities that data systems have evolved over the years in terms of being able to support these kind of grants and fine-grained access control capabilities and anonymization capabilities, you can apply those same things to your metadata system as well, and it should work, fingers crossed.
And I think regarding the RBAC perspective, a lot of the metadata systems, like one of the things that we will be working on, and a lot of metadata systems I think should also consider, is integration with the existing RBAC policies. So you are either replicating the same roles to the users that have access to the data discovery platform, but they have exactly the same viewpoint from Snowflake or BigQuery, like what they already had, or the other type of, I think, RBAC that I see, because a lot of our users are also on the ops or PM or more just the pure consumer side, is actually doing the RBAC replication or sync with the BI tools. Because BI tools also have may have a lot of sensitive data from that side. I think the other part around PII is, so as a metadata platform, we won't be accessing the data, but for us, by default, we do access the query history, and we do sometimes, we will get exposed, whether we intend or not, from somebody's query if they are accessing a specific column that may be a sensitive column. And for us, like what we do today is we allow customers to define which are the columns that, like put a tag on those columns, and we will remove those data in memory before it gets written to disk, so that anything that you access within Selectstar, even though you might have stepped into a query or anything, it's already masked out, and anything that we run on top of it is already masked. But overall, the definition of that PII, which are the fields that are sensitive, I think is also a very interesting area that a lot of modern data warehouses are starting to provide capabilities within, because they already host the data. And I think, companies like Snowflake, they already starting to working on, pointing out which are the potentially the sensitive data and allow customers to automatically tag them. So I think integration with that tagging, I think, is also very interesting. That can be replicated into the discovery system.
I want to check real quick. I know we're coming up on time here. I think we're actually a little bit past time, and I want to be respectful of schedule. We have some more questions. If possible, I'd love to get to a few more of those, or we can conclude right now, but I want to check first about your schedule and see if we can go a few more minutes. Thumbs up, thumbs down? Wrap up? Okay, cool. We have a lot more. Obviously, a lot of interest here, and we have definitely a lot more resources over on the data mesh learning community, especially on the Slack board. There's a lot of channels, and I know a lot of us are involved there. A lot of other experts too. So what I'd recommend is there's some great questions outstanding, but let's move it over to Slack, and we can go into this in a lot more detail. And also we can dig into deep dives on some of the other questions that will come up earlier, or some of the other parts of discussion. So with that, I want to thank everybody. Sophie, Mark, Shirshanka, Shinji, also Scott for putting these together. Audra, I know you're back there. Thank you all very much, and really appreciate the discussion today. There will be a recording of this going up, I believe, on YouTube, and that'll be open to the public. And thank you very much for your time and your insights today.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, Paco. This was awesome.